Hello, welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with George Ortega and Jamie Soden. And today we're going to be talking about, times when we've blamed ourselves for certain things in the past that have happened. Everyone has some experience like of some regret where they did something stupid, or maybe they didn't but they think they did. So I'll give an example of how, I blamed myself for being unable to get a job. And this is something that went on from the time when I was like 16 up to the time when I was 25 before I finally got my job. Because I thought, if am I not good enough? If I was just smarter, or if I was better socially and able to talk to people, then maybe I would have done better on the applications or on the interviews. What's wrong with me? And so I was blaming myself for not being able to get a job, for not being impressive enough, for not having whatever it was, even though I didn't know what people were looking for. And that was a source of major depression for a while. But now I look at it and I realize that, first of all, nothing was up to me what made me be very bad at communication to begin with. I have Asperger's syndrome, and I've never been that good of a communicator, never that good at talking to people. So that was part of it, but also the fact that I was homeschooled, and there's a bias against that too, has made it hard to get a job because people, unless you have a high school diploma or you're at least enrolled in high school, traditional school, it's hard. But still, here's the deal. First of all, if people had a free will, they could will themselves to do whatever they wanted. And we know that that's not the case, and because they don't make themselves what they are. But I think there's something else more to it. Even if somebody granted free will, which is impossible, what wouldn't everybody be employed? And I realize not everybody's lucky enough to be able to get a job. Not everybody's lucky enough to be able to do certain things. So it's kind of weird, I don't blame myself for things, and I think it's very important to spread this message that ultimately nobody is responsible for the circumstances they find themselves in, or they're going to blame themselves for being unable to get a job. They're going to blame themselves for failed relationships. They're going to blame themselves for their own mental illness and wonder why they didn't choose to not have their mental illness. That's what I have to say about that right now. So maybe Jamie or George can give an example of when they've blamed themselves for something in the past.
George, let's hear your last story.
Okay, well, basically, in different times in the past, and even up to today, my relations with my brothers and their families haven't been all that good. I've blamed my brothers for certain things. They've blamed me for things. I've blamed myself for not. I mean, yeah, the free will belief, has kind of compelled me to blame myself for the way, I responded to them, for whatever. And here's the thing. So with free will belief, it pretty much it ends exploration. In other words, my brothers are doing something wrong because just they're not good people, and I'm doing something wrong because I'm not a good person at all. And that's just such a simplistic, misguided, basically incomplete explanation. Because then, to the extent that I began to realize, wait a minute, I don't have a free will, they don't have a free will, then what became clearer and clearer to me was that they and I are different. Rather than my having this kind of liability or this fault, for not being able to relate to them, I realized I'm a lot smarter than they are. I can't blame them for it, but that created a great difference. When I'm talking about certain things, they can't really understand. On the other hand, in terms of social intelligence, which is I think very important, I'm not as adept in that as they are. They're much better at that. So so again, so then we end up I end up thinking, well, all right, we have different qualities. They didn't pick their qualities, I didn't pick mine, and it just makes there's no blame, there's no self blame. It just makes things so much not only easier to accept, but easier to understand. Because, you know, we can also, like, to the extent we understand these things, we can work on them.
Yes. I mean, yeah, people are different, and the free will belief really kind of makes us ignore the differences in the abilities, the regular intelligence or the social intelligence, and ignores that some people can do better at certain things than others.
Yeah, like Chandler, when you were saying, like, you know, you related, you have Asperger's. I mean, when I hear you talk, I actually like hear a lot more intelligence in what and how you speak than in the vast majority of people that I've listened to. And so, like, you know, sometimes this Asperger's designation might have you think otherwise, but, like, you know, it's actually because you know, you're thinking in a way that's quote unquote more superior to others, that I think created a lot of your problems. You know, you're more logical, you're less biased, you're, I think, maybe more mature in your thinking. And it's by, you know, by coming to this understanding we don't have a free will, that we get to these kinds of realizations.
Yeah, and the whole social intelligence thing is, I think, a major hindrance, because what it comes down to is, I think that there's sort of one type of intelligence comes at the expense of another. And this is just sort of an interesting idea, but a person who's intelligent about certain areas of thought, certain philosophy or science and certain ideas, they're more withdrawn, they're less likely to be social with other people, and so that keeps them from developing the social skills that other people might have. But here's what's great is there's a way around this, is that by teams of people working together on projects, you overcome the weaknesses of other people with your strengths and vice versa.
So, Jamie, have you thought of, you know, an example in your case where, you know, you just wrongly blamed yourself for what was just not in your control?
I don't know where to begin with that because there's been a lot of times where I blame myself for things, you know, like the when I come out of like spiteful things about my family after an argument, and I say, oh you shouldn't have done this, and I just don't know where to begin, man. I literally don't.
Well, Jamie, I think what kind of like what you're saying is, like, it's one thing to understand we don't have a free will. It's kind of like if somebody like teaches you how to do a sit up, or to lift a weight or something, so you know it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we know that knowing how to do that isn't enough. Like, we have to go to the gym, or we have to exercise, you know, continually to put that knowledge into practice. And I think it's very similar with this no free will thing. We may know that we don't have a free will, but it's one thing to know that, and it's much, much more difficult, you know, but definitely possible to just more and more put it into practice in our lives.
Hey Chandler, how would you put it into practice in your life?
Well, I've put a lot of this no free will thing into practice in my life. In the fact that, since I've been doing this podcast and talk about it constantly, I just naturally think of it. And it applies in my relationship with my mother, or with my sister and my girlfriend too now. When people do things, I'm aware, just through constant reinforcement of this idea, realizing that yes, they might be doing something that's hurting me, but ultimately they don't know better, you know? Because no, realizing people, they don't make themselves, and that they don't control anything in the desires that make them do things. And so I think I've become less blaming of other people. But most importantly, guys, I think the major change in my life was that for a while I was very mean to, Christians and stuff for a while, because I was so mad at them for, choosing to worship this sadistic God that's sending people to hell, you know. And it's kind of interesting. But now I look at it and realize, these nobody, since I realize nobody chooses their religion that they grow up with. Then I started to realize that was the first step into it. I started to realize, wait, people don't choose their religion, and then I got into the idea that they don't choose their sexuality, and then that's where it snowballed, and I've become less less religionist and less sexist in as far as people's sexual identities. Just like I'm not racist, and I also got over speciesism because that's one powerful application is realizing that these other animals that happen to have been born as species of animals that humans eat or torture in experiments, they didn't choose to be that, you know? And so I view them as victims, and it kind of helps me bring this equality of all life. And a big part of that is this understanding that there's no free will.
Yeah, because there's a huge bias against animals, especially with the animal rights campaigning. I mean, there was a hypocrite who, you know, um, you, how can I put this? In the news story and the link I posted on your Facebook wall, a man killed a rabbit to eat it, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, well, why didn't you just eat meat that was already, that was already on the shelves, that was already dead? I mean, why did you have to kill another bunny just to eat it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and see, here's what's interesting about it, Jamie. Part of the problem is there are so many vegetarians and vegans and other animal rights activists who are blaming these people for their treatment of animals.
Hmm.
And part of the problem is that even though what they say is right, is that they shouldn't be doing this, they wouldn't want that done to them. The
Hmm.
problem is they come across as being mean, and people perceive them as self-righteous, and they don't listen to them. And
Yeah.
so this is very important because ironically,
I do see where you're coming from on that. Yeah, I mean, you have to approach it from a different angle. You can't just go around name calling because people don't respond to that very well, do they?
yeah,
Yeah.
you kind of have to change your approach because I think the biggest part of that, is that the reason that we are saying that, when we're blaming them, there's two things going on. First of all, we are saying that they could have done otherwise, that they have a free will. Second of all, there's something else, is we are saying there are other options of which they could have chosen. And here's the deal, you can say that that's true in the sense that had they been aware of those other options, and there not been these myths about that you have to eat meat to get protein, a lot of people would have switched vegetarian, years ago, if they realized that were these myths around there. So some of it is lack of empathy and sociopaths that just don't care who they hurt. I think that's a case, but a big part of it is people that are just believing lies and don't know better.
Yeah. Like the myth about vegetarianism, not enough protein. That's one of the biggest myths out there. Wasn't it stated by somebody that broccoli had more protein than beef?
Yeah, actually, and it's very interesting. But this is another powerful example of blaming yourself. What's interesting is that, like, I could have, if I had believed in free will, like I could have blamed myself for the first 25 years of my life when I was eating meat and cheese and eggs and just eating, typically how most Americans do. But I
A lot of
realized, well,
it's to do
wait
with
a minute.
American culture, though. I mean, you've got this fast food culture going on where to be with a cool crowd, you were kind of expected in a way to eat pizza or even worse, hamburgers. And hamburgers from McDonald's and stuff like that are some of the fattiest foods you can get, aren't they? So
Yeah, and that's what's interesting. But I realized that it was something the culture did to me. It wasn't something that I chose. And because of that, now I've changed a lot of the way I eat and all sorts of stuff. But I realized that I didn't blame myself, at least. Of course, there was also the problem of blaming other people for a while before I got into this whole free will thing, before I even talked to George and watched his show originally.
Yeah,
hmm,
that's interesting because I Somebody told me recently that her daughter is a vegan because of compassionate reasons, because she understands how cruelly these animals are treated. But then her daughter also believes that we have a free will. Now, I'm just trying to imagine how difficult it is for this person because, like, holding this belief that what we do to animals is so wrong, and then living in a world where so many people just don't care, you know, I on some level, this person has to basically judge these people as really evil, but that doesn't work. So it's almost like a person has to kind of like just build up and maintain this huge denial about people, to not blame them, while having this free will belief.
Yeah, there's two approaches that people deal with this, George. One of the approaches people try to deal with this whole animal thing and the cruelty to animals is they try to say, oh, well, the animals don't feel pain, or they try to
They
justify
try
it.
to justify it somehow, yeah.
Right. They either try to say that it's not that it's not a wrong thing.
Or try to say that it's not as bad as crimes against humans. They try to make that example, and that's one of the stupid examples of it's arguably one of the stupidest things I've ever heard of. Actually, animals, other creatures are still sentient. They still feel, they still experience suffering. If you whack a rabbit on the leg, it's gonna squeak, isn't it? So
Yeah. And see, here's the deal, Jamie. That's what they do to try to reduce the guilt they feel of contributing to something. But we have found another way through the understanding that nobody is fundamentally responsible. Nobody freely chose anything ever that happened. And what's interesting about that is even though it's still difficult to realize that people are still going to continue to treat other animals, humans included, very badly, um, we at the same time we don't do the self-blaming for what we've done, and we don't blame other people. And I think this is in fact our only hope at change, because this doesn't require us to say that it's good or that it's justified to cause this immense suffering to these animals. um, that's just great, is we're not justifying anything, we're simply telling what is. We're basically we're doing science. We're not making a moral judgment on people, but we are saying what is that people have practices which are harming these other beings, and it's about getting them to identify with those they're hurting and following the golden rule. That's the approach I'm trying to take with it.
people do complain about crimes against humanity whenever they hear about a terrorist, murdering an innocent family and stuff. Beating kids up and killing their mothers and stuff like that. Through bombings or whatever. But they don't apply the same morality to other creatures. Other creatures that can still experience just as much pain as we can. Yeah.
Right, and Jamie, that's an example of the harm this free will belief does, because, like, basically it causes people to not be able to look at what they're doing. On some level, they know that how we're treating animals is so horrible, so wrong, but because they believe in free will, then they have to attribute that wrong to themselves, and they can't do that. So, as you guys were saying before, they'll say, well, these animals don't feel pain, or just invent some kind of nonsense. So to the extent they can overcome this free will belief, they can objectively, without blaming themselves, without all this guilt and stuff, say, oh my God, what are we doing to these animals? And just, they can see it more clearly.
Because animals, they can still get protein from, like, eating vegetation. We already know that. I mean, bamboo is one of the sources of protein for uh, pandas in China, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So yeah, because I found out that bamboo has lots of protein in it.
And
It's just
gorillas don't eat any. Gorillas, I think, are vegan,
yeah,
as powerful as they are.
yeah, they're muscular creatures as well, like elephants are. Elephants are muscular and they're vegan.
Yeah, not to mention horses. Horses are cool too. I like examples of these big, strong animals, the elephants, the horses, the gorillas, because it just busts the myth. Like you don't have to look far to see examples of successful vegan animals. And so I think that's our main thing, because while I don't think there's anything that we'll ever be able to do about the hardcore sociopaths who don't care about the suffering they're causing to others, just by exposing these myths and explaining, well, this isn't true. It's not true that you have to be all weak and die if you're vegan. That's just not true. And it's through understanding these that we will automatically change people. It's not because people are freely choosing, but once they have new information always changes you.
And
Yeah.
Chandler, you just got me thinking with the issue of psychopaths. I mean, our understanding is that like the part of their brain that's supposed to process empathy and all isn't
It's not
working.
working. Yeah.
Right, but maybe, but like we're never like, we don't really understand why it's not working. So it may be that this free will belief, just imposes so much guilt on this part of the brain, this processing center, that it just goes into denial. It just like it could be that to the extent that these psychopaths are taught that actually nobody has a free will, that then maybe they might be able to look more objectively at what they do and then empathize without, again, what I'm saying is that denial may be responsible for their lack of empathy.
It's the same thing with criminals. I mean, they go into denial when people talk down on them and say that they're like, scum of the earth when they've committed a crime against someone's family, so.
Yeah, and what's interesting about it, guys, is like along with this understanding that nobody's to blame, nobody freely chose anything, comes an incredible amount of honesty. The ability to admit that, yes, I've done terrible things in the past, and now I realize that they were bad and I try to correct it. But there's absolutely no place for guilt, I don't think. I think guilt is just, a feeling like feeling bad, but it doesn't achieve anything. And so I'm trying to get people to move beyond the guilt and just like realizing, it's like forgetting to carry a one when you're doing addition in math. That I try to think of it in terms of a mistake, that even though it's actually much more serious than that in terms of consequences, ultimately that's what it comes down to, is we are
There's
not.
also a fear element because if people admit to wrongdoing, sometimes they worry about what other people think of them. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting. Like in this world, people, because they believe in free will, people they don't like to admit that they did something wrong.
Of course. But that's the reason for guilt in the first place, because they feel like they've done something wrong and they just deny any wrongdoing.
Yeah. And see, here's the deal. Once you admit that you've done something wrong, well, then other people, they are blaming you for doing that, and then they punish you in various ways. And so people, they hide their wrongdoings from people to avoid punishment, which makes sense. I mean, we all seek pleasure and avoid pain, right?
Hmm.
If everybody what didn't believe in free will, if everybody were determinists or incompatibilists, basically we would openly confess our faults to each other, and we would be there to support each other and help each other change. So that would be a much better way, because that seems to be the approach that a lot of people do, like I imagine, people who have certain addictions,
Yeah.
and they've all been there. They share their experiences and they try to help each other through tough times. That's basically what we're doing, only we're doing it on a broader scale. We're trying to say, we're telling, stuff that we might have done bad in the past, or something, but we don't blame ourselves, and we're not judging people here.
Yeah. There's also the non-psychopathic people who are severely depressed because they feel like they could have done otherwise, and they just feel so much guilt that they feel like the world's on top of them.
Oh yeah, so much of like, well, like with happiness, self-esteem is very correlated with happiness. The more a person likes themselves, the happier they're going to be. And liking oneself to a great extent, I think, is about like considering oneself a good person. So yeah, there's some people who either considering themselves a good person and also considering themselves successful. So yeah, when people kind of like believe in free will and through no fault of their own, they're not able to succeed at certain things or they have certain faults and then they blame themselves, then that leads to like that erodes their self-esteem, and that leads to a lot of self-blame, a lot of depression, and ultimately sometimes with suicide with people. I mean, like this free will belief just causes people to just like to
Mm.
afflict themselves. Yeah, it's really horrible.
And I was really shocked. Like I said in another podcast, and like I said to Chandler, like in private conversations as well, I was really shocked to find out that someone who supposedly is scientific minded as Michio Kaku. I mean, he's supposed to be a scientist, right? Yet he comes out of a ridiculous claim based on quantum mechanics that you know people um, can override their circumstance.
Well, Jamie, Chandler and I were talking about this before this podcast, and this is like one of the huge problems in the world that
Mm.
many of our academic leaders, our political leaders, and all, they know how to learn, but they are not very good at thinking. So this whole issue of free will forces people to learn how to think, and this world desperately needs so much more of that.
Of course, yeah. I'm not sure whether Michio Kaku is deliberately hiding this important information, or whether he genuinely believes that free will is possible because of this, you know, um, Heisenberg uncertainty principle and all that stuff. I mean, it doesn't make sense either way. I mean, even if it was randomness, how would it make free will possible? You know.
Exactly. And Jamie, that's so clear to you. That's so clear to Chandler and me and so many of us. So then, like, what we're faced is with, we have to figure out, like, it must be that for a lot of even these scientists who are supposed to be trained to be very objective, their
Mm.
emotions and their beliefs completely override and hijack their reasoning. They can't see the truth because they have an emotional need to see the world in a certain way. And we got to figure out a way to overcome that.
Yeah, and as I was explaining to someone on a video on YouTube, because he was claiming that these so-called people, I forget their names, but he was claiming that these people with Nobel prizes and stuff, right? He was saying that their view on free will was somehow credible just because they have a degree in something. Well, just because you have a degree in something doesn't necessarily mean you are knowledgeable on a subject. I mean, sometimes people cheat and they get degrees, don't they? So
Yeah, I don't look at how many degrees somebody has to determine whether what they're saying is true or false.
yeah, I mean, you can cheat in a test. I mean, people do that in school all the time, don't they? So
And again, we have to look at the way many of these people get their degrees is not by learning how to think, because I don't think that's really taught very much in either college or high school or before that. These people are getting degrees just because they know how to learn and memorize. And so like so fine, they might know a lot, but they're clueless in terms of understanding what they know.
Yeah, George, this is like the people who try to memorize chess games and memorize what moves they're supposed to make in a situation, but don't understand the underlying principles that enable them to think of what move to make when in new situations they've never encountered.
Exactly.
We've actually gone over our 30 minutes, so I probably want to end this one, but this has been great. You've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion with Chandler Klebs, Jamie Soden, and George Ortega, and we talked about, some times when we blamed ourselves or blamed others and some of the implications it can have, how people don't have to feel guilty once they understand things aren't their fault. And we'll be continuing this in future episodes. Thank you for listening. Bye.